Hello all, welcome back to Dad's Planning Politics. It's Frederica and of course
Mark,
Mark.
hi everyone.
I'm glad he got the cue then. I was worried for a second he wasn't going to be able to finish my sentence.
Good to see you all. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. I'm glad to be back with you all. Obviously, there's been huge updates happening recently. World-changing events, international law-changing events that have been happening in recent days. And as always, it revolves around Donald Trump. So we'll get into that a little bit, and I think the focus of this episode is going to be purely on Venezuela and what the kidnapping, you could call it, of the Venezuelan leader Maduro means for the future of Venezuela and the US's place in Latin America, etc. Do you want to start with some of the details of what happened?
Yes, of course. So on Saturday, the 3rd of January, the US Special Forces took out a lot of the radar stations, etc., and security stations and stormed the secure compound of Maduro and his wife. And within an hour or so, arrested him and his wife and got them out of the country. And really, from the US point of view, now have control of Venezuela. And Maduro is now in New York and going to be appearing in court for drug charges and all sorts of criminal charges under US law.
Yeah, so that's the current update on what's been happening there. Obviously, this has been questioned for a while now, right? Over the past few months, anytime the Epstein files were mentioned, it seems that Donald Trump veered off in a different direction. And one of those directions happened to be, should we invade Venezuela or not? And what is happening in Venezuela and the disagreements that Trump was having with Maduro. Because even though Maduro is often seen as a right-wing politician, Trump and him do not have aligned interests. So it's interesting to see how they didn't play off each other, but were very much against each other in every way.
As background, Venezuela controls 20% of the world's oil reserves, so this is an important point to keep in mind. The recently released US security paper talks about reigniting the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is a historic doctrine that talked about America controlling the Western Hemisphere. This is really a historic document. They were worried about Spain and Portugal engaging with their former colonies in South America, and thus the Monroe Doctrine. Somehow Trump has got hold of this and really likes it, and he's now renamed it, called the Donroe Doctrine, as in the Donald Roe Doctrine. And it's all about the US controlling the Western Hemisphere, all the Americas. And what's scary about this is that, in a sense, this is America saying, we'll control the Western Hemisphere, i.e. Russia and China get out, and you're not going to have control here, and leave the European hemisphere to Russia and the Asian hemisphere to China. So this is a really scary thing, because the US invading a sovereign country sounds familiar, doesn't it? A bit like Russia invading Ukraine, and of course China looking at this thinking, well, maybe it's a time for us to invade Taiwan, because it's exactly the same scenario.
I mean, I've always find it funny. I feel like, I know you're coming from all of these conversations as being a slightly more conservative than I am, but it feels like the conversations always end up coming at things that I have said in previous episodes, but in those previous episodes you've disagreed with me and said, oh no, well, hegemony, which is the word for when a country wants to take control of other countries in the region and have a hegemonic power over them, means that they just want to have power over those countries. That's what the US is trying to do. It's very imperialist, so it's harking back to the days of empires like the Ottoman Empire, the Great British Empire, and this desire to claim land and claim territory and have power over it and other people. So that's, again, what is happening with Donald Trump at the moment. The Monroe Doctrine, even when it was announced, was a controversial thing. Like, call something historic and that justifies its existence. The Monroe Doctrine was always the US trying to assert its power and take control of countries that are not under its responsibility, countries that are not, they don't have sovereign control over. The United States is its own entity. The countries surrounding it should not be beholden to the United States in any way. But the Monroe Doctrine is the US trying to figure out how to use its power to assert peace, or to at least, improve the economic gain from the countries surrounding them. So Trump is just harking back to all of that, harking back to this idea of imperialism, harking back to this idea of how can I control everyone around me in order to keep myself protected. And there's so many arguments around this, what's been happening in Venezuela in the past few days, right? Maduro is not known as a good leader, definitely not. And many people have even celebrated him being removed from power. But at the end of the day, this move by the Trump administration was not done to free the Venezuelan people. It was done to ensure that the US has access to 20% of the world's oil resources. And, you know, I think last year the oil exports in Venezuela made up about 30% of their GDP. So it's a massive amount of their GDP. You take that away from a country that already has terrible economic growth, what do they have left?
It is interesting, though, because the oil reserves, all the oil companies, it was all nationalized by Maduro, right? Primarily US oil companies, I'm sure European as well, and others, were in control of it, and then they were producing 20% of the world's oil. Since it's been nationalized, far less efficient, and producing something like 3 to 5% of the world's oil, right? So there's a huge opportunity to get it back to a modern scenario, and it's a valid question you make, Freddie, because the average person in Venezuela is leading a terrible life, right? In terms of lack of access to medical, super low salaries, etc. So it's an economic basket case in a way. The big question is, you know, Trump talks about running Venezuela. Marco Rubio steps that back, of course. And Marco Rubio is an important figure in this because he is Hispanic. He's always been a hawk around Venezuela and Cuba. He's of Cuban descent, etc. So he's always wanted to take an aggressive stance there. But he's talking about, you know, working with the Venezuelans in improving the infrastructure of the country to obviously help the US oil companies and US things, but hopefully it should help the average person in Venezuela. That will be an interesting scenario.
I mean, yeah, it's an interesting scenario, but at the end of the day, you can't go around and invade another country and just take their leader away. I mean, it's not going to create a solution. Solutions don't come from creating more political instability. They come from a slow advance to having a better democracy.
Agreed.
And looking into the history of Venezuela, actually, if we really want to look into its history, right? It's obviously been chucked around a lot by the various conquistadors, whether they were from Spain or Portugal, but I think there were even German conquistadors in Venezuela for a while there. So obviously been tossed around a few times by colonizers in the past. The US is coming in as another colonizer. In recent years, the leader before Maduro was famously Hugo Chavez. And Chavez is known for a particular type of political stance, which is kind of socialist. It's really more capitalist than it is socialist when you look at it in real economic output, etc. But it is against imperialism. It's against the US taking any power over Venezuela. It's against outside interference. And that very type of policy is defined by US imperialism. Like you don't get to a point where the country is so supportive of independence without there being something like the US that keeps trying to take their independence away, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does.
I'm not sure if I'm phrasing it in the right way, but
it does make sense. And so, you know, Trump is emboldened after the successful intervention and the kidnapping of Maduro and his wife. And so now he's threatening Colombia. He brought up Greenland again as something the US needs. And so I'm sure the US military is sort of super concerned with Trump suggesting further incursions, because even though the US military is the greatest in the world, there's a limit, right, to this stuff. You can imagine the craziness that can happen, you know, by taking over a country. And the US doesn't have a good history of regime change in the world. Think Iraq, think Afghanistan, think Vietnam, etc. And what's interesting, many of the people who voted for Trump, they didn't sign up for this. They wanted a US focus first. So now Trump seems to be a little drunk with the power of his foreign excursions. So it's really ironic, given this is not what MAGA wanted.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about who he is, he's obviously some kind of egomaniac, right? He wants to have all the power in the world. He can't stop at being the so-called leader of the free world. He needs to have more people, under his control. And it's never going to stop, that desire for control, that desire for doing whatever he wants. He thinks that everyone is lesser than him. So it's never going to end until someone stops him. And at this point in time, is anyone stopping him? No.
It will end if too many people come home in body bags, US soldiers, and the cost of this gets out of control, because that will end in the midterms, right? Because this will be really interesting what the impact of this is on the midterms.
Well, this is the point, right? Like, politically, hopefully there's a way in which America can wrestle back the government from Trump and his administration, but it seems pretty difficult at this point in time. And I personally don't have that much hope that another candidate can even run and win in the next election. I think Trump is very happy to be in office. I think that he wouldn't construct that billion-dollar ballroom that he's constructing just to use it for another 2 years. I think he's planning on staying in office for a very long time.
Constitution, if the US is at war, you can delay votes and delay elections, etc. So this is setting it up very nicely for that, saying you're at war with Venezuela, for example.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I mean, like we've been saying for such a long time, the Epstein files have been released, but have they been released? Because most of us been redacted. And exactly at the time when his critics are asking him, why is it redacted? Why aren't we seeing more of what was actually in the Epstein files? He launches a war. Essentially a war. Like, kidnapping the leader of a foreign country is starting a war. So he's done this exactly at a time when people are questioning his every move. So it really seems like a deflection, I would say, away from his domestic policy onto his international policy.
It is, and it should be a wake-up call for the rest of the world, right? The United Nations obviously is saying this is a terrible thing to do and chastising the US on this. But of course, the US is a permanent member of the Security Council, so can veto anything. Likewise, this talk of Greenland, invading Greenland or taking over Greenland, would be the end of NATO, because Greenland, as part of Denmark, is a NATO member. And so it's sort of turning upside down the world order dramatically, and I hope it's a message for the Europeans to get their act together vis-a-vis Ukraine, because in fact the biggest threat to the world may not be China and Russia, it may be the US.
Look, I completely agree with you along all of those lines, and I think it's important to realize, right, that people can really get drunk with power, and you don't know what moves they're going to do from there. They're not in touch with the everyday person anymore, especially when you have such vast amounts of money such as Donald Trump has. I mean, I think most billionaires probably don't have any sense of reality or in touch with any ordinary people, just because they don't have the troubles and the issues that everyday people go through. So how could they possibly understand? I think that's that same thing. When you have such ridiculous amounts of power, you probably lose touch with the amount of lives that you're truly affecting on a day-to-day basis. And, we've talked about this a few times, but the more that Donald Trump makes moves like this, which are traditionally against what you are allowed to do, as in go kidnap a leader of a foreign country, it's telling countries across the world you can do the same thing and there will be no retribution. It's telling countries all across, whatever region of the world that you're more in touch with, whether it be Latin America, whether it be Africa, whether it be Europe, whether it be, Asia. It's telling all these countries, feel free to go into your neighboring country and kidnap its leader and see what happens. And feel free to take a colonial position in that country and administer its governments over the following years. And it's removing those international laws and, the effects of those laws in a really, really dangerous way.
So it's a difficult position for countries like Australia and the UK and France, allies of the US, and it's interesting their comments on this. Maduro regime was very bad for the people, but not obviously supporting this move to kidnap a foreign leader. So it's a really difficult path for them to tread, because again, they're worried about upsetting Trump, and yet they've got to do the right thing and say the real thing in this regard. So it'll be interesting, United Nations and discussions around that. But at the same time, the same weekend this happened, Mamdani, the new mayor of New York, was inaugurated. So that's the hope of the left to see what he can do as mayor of New York. So that will be interesting how that plays out as well. And his opinions regarding this, given Maduro is on trial in New York.
Yeah, definitely. I did have a bit more to say on the other thing. I just wanted to say one more thing before we moved on to Mamdani and what he means for even the Western world as a whole. But I just wanted to say about what was happening in Venezuela is I think that my main belief about like the problem with humanity as a whole is complacency. I think a lot of the time when there are issues, maybe we recognize that there are issues, but we don't do anything about it. We talk about it, we sit on podcasts and we discuss it, but are we out there right now doing anything about what's going on? Not necessarily. This is the most that we really think we can do. And so you look at all these European countries, right? You look at France, you look at the UK, then you look at Australia, you look at Canada. And these are countries that have very democratic values. And if we have any hope of halting what Trump is doing to the world right now, his imperialist agenda, these countries really have to be drawing a line in the sand and saying, no, that's not okay. Trump, you can't be doing this. You need to respect international borders, etc. But because they're not doing that, that's allowing Trump to go that one step further. And the only countries who are even bothering to say anything are countries like Spain and a few other smaller countries. But, you know, a really progressive government in Spain has spoken out against it and said, look, the Maduro regime obviously wasn't a good one either, but you can't be going into other countries and denying them of their sovereignty in such a way.
Against it because they've invested a lot in Venezuela, so they're really upset, clearly.
Well, definitely, and it's really at the point where Australia should be speaking out against it as well. We shouldn't be so scared of Trump that we're unable to even say something like, don't go that far.
But he's gone, it's already done, so what do you do now, right? It's really interesting because...
You think he's not capable of invading another country?
No, I think he is capable.
So
but
he literally already said today, Cuba, watch out, I'm coming for you next.
I know, but I think the US military may pull him back somewhat because there's a limit to how much the US military can take on as well at any point in time.
I think that when you're in a position with as much power as Donald Trump has, I don't know how much the military really has a say in it.
But they only have so many resources, right?
They have a lot of resources compared to the rest of the world.
I get it, but taking over countries is not a trivial exercise.
No,
right?
It's not trivial, but I feel like nothing's going to stop Trump until he's left by himself in a field without any soldiers left. Do you know what I mean? I think that he's blind to the real effect on his army and of other people's.
Anyway, as usual, you know, all the media around the world is dominated by Venezuela, and so this thing continues, you know, Trump and his what he does dominating the world media agenda on and on. But you're right, I think the more norms that are broken, the more people get used to it and the worse things potentially become. So that's the dangerous part of this. And it's interesting to think about how this can be walked back in the future and how long it would take it to be walked back so that you know, the United Nations can regain power and countries can support that. It's an interesting thought to think about how long that might take.
I mean, it had a very fickle hold on power in the first place, right? There was never really that much it could do, but it's scary to see how far it's fallen, even from the position the UN was in.
Because I think they always had really strong support from the US particularly, okay? And without that, they're a much weaker scenario. But again, this is why I'm almost about the European Union, right? They have a huge responsibility here, and yet I don't see them stepping up.
Yeah, and I think it's quite shocking because you Look, this is I'm not really a big history buff, so my only real comparison for countries not doing anything when a foreign power is invading other countries is Hitler. So I'm going to use this example, right? So we look back, the Europeans have already had an experience with a country that slowly starts taking over other countries more and more and crossing the line again and again. And back then the Europeans didn't do anything about it. They sat around hoping that Hitler would become happy with what he'd gained and he would eventually just stop his gradual control over all of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
But did he? No, of course, he never stopped. Because I think once you have that desire for growth and expanding your country and that imperialist agenda, I don't think you you can stop.
Got it, yeah. You get drunk with the power.
You get drunk with power. And the Europeans, they saw this happen once before. They saw this magnificent, you could almost say, growth in power, and they saw how badly it came to affect them. Because if only they'd stopped Hitler earlier, then maybe the war wouldn't have been as disastrous as it was, right? But now we're seeing another instance, an incredibly different instance, of a leader taking more and more power and more countries within his hold. And is anyone doing anything to stop it? No. What happens if he takes that next step? It will be too late to stop him, is the real worry. So yeah, the Europeans do need to be doing something about it, because they're losing power every second that they don't.
And particularly given they were South America was their colonies, right? Particularly Portugal and Spain and stuff, part of Europe, right? They had this whole historic link there. So, Mamdani, your thoughts?
The savior of the world. I think it's interesting because a lot of people react to the joy about Mamdani and they question it, right? Like Aussies, for example, will go, "Why do you care so much about the new mayor of New York? I mean, he's not even like the president, and he's in a country across the world from here, so why do you care?" It's not about just him being the new mayor of New York, it's about his politics. It's about this form of socialist politics and this idea of hope and this idea of somehow seeing the light in the world, even when it feels really dark right now, and the unity that we want to have with our entire community really being represented by Mamdani. And we're not really seeing anyone across the world doing that in such a successful way right now. Solidarity in a really important way, and I think everyone in New York seems to be coming together. And what a beautiful thing. I think even right now, like, I kind of get goosebumps thinking about it, because the rest of the world is so divided by hatred that to see such joy is really inspiring.
It'll be really, hopefully it all works really well. He seems to have some very good policies. The trick will be in the execution. Of course, these are not easy policies to implement. Extra taxes for the very wealthy to support rent controls, etc., and free transport and these sorts of things. So it'll be fascinating to see. But you're right, a new force in the world, potentially for good. So I hope you enjoyed this first podcast of the new year. We look forward to talking with you in 2 weeks' time with a new episode. And in the meantime, any comments or questions, let us know.
Please let us know. Thanks so much for listening, guys, and we'll see you so soon.
Bye.
Bye.